Could you just retell for us a little bit how you came to meet Hannah Arendt? What was the capacity in which you knew her? Sort of what was your relationship with her? In whatever amount of detail you would like to share.
Well, first off, I mean, it's an extraordinary gift. I'm still sort of astounded that it happened.
Mm-hmm.
I had come from University of California, Berkeley, where I was doing graduate work. I was back in New York City for just a little while. And I heard that she was coming to teach at the graduate faculty of the New School. Mm-hmm. I did a little bit of work with the undergraduate program at the New School at that point. So I decided that I wanted to study with her. I had looked at the human condition. Mm-hmm. I didn't understand it, and I loved it. I didn't even work on trying to understand it. I just read it and thought it made sense, even though I couldn't translate it. There was something original happening there that felt like, I mean, if I said it in dramatic tones now, I didn't think that way at the time, but she writes about hearing about Heidegger. She says, you know, there is a thinker one can perhaps learn to think. Mm-hmm. And so she wanted to study with him. People flocked. I think that was the reaction when I read the book. So I heard she was going to be at the graduate faculty. And I took myself across the street, went into the office, whoever was there, and said, I'd like to take that course. And they said, you're not even a student here. Mm-hmm. This is atypical, incidentally. I follow the rules because it's less trouble. Right. Unless they're trouble, and then you don't follow the rules. But I start trying to follow the rules. So I went in and said, I want to take it. They said, you're not a student. I said, I'll apply. They said, fine. I applied, and they accepted me on the spot. But then told me I couldn't be in the class because it was only for super advanced students. You know, big star, seminar, maybe 12 people. I thought that was reasonably sensible, so I went away, and then I got a phone call saying, no, she insists on interviewing everybody who's interested in the class. She won't take just the people we're sending. So I went over for the interview, and which is still vivid in my mind, I have to say. It's a small office. I opened the door. Smack in front of the door is this desk. I mean, a little tiny office, you know, sort of 2 steps, chair barely fitted in. Behind this desk, which is empty, it's not her office, is Hannah Arendt, whom I had not seen yet. Very few people think the next touch is as funny as I did, but it got me through the interview because it amused me so much. She smoked, you know, all the time. And she smoked a brand called True.
Oh, okay.
So I'm sitting there with her about to ask me questions, seeing this, she had one of those glass cigarette boxes, saying true, 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 true. I thought that was kind of a charming touch. Yeah. Beyond that, I don't remember very much. I don't remember what she asked. I certainly don't remember what I said. I didn't remember it 10 minutes later. I was in one of those states, you know. Apparently, there was some compatibility because she put me in the class. Right. That was the Contemporary Experiences, was it? No, it was Europe Between the Wars. In a typical Arendt class, we read Kafka, Musil, Man Without Qualities, Heller's Catch-22, Hadjo Halbern's History of the Time, Brecht. This is an advanced philosophy seminar.
And your background wasn't really in philosophy before this at all, so you maybe had taken some undergraduate courses in philosophy?
No. No. I took her class. I wrote a paper for her. She gave me an A+. And then she called me up and said, would you be my teaching assistant? And I said, Dr. Arendt, I had one philosophy class as an undergraduate, and I had one political theory course at Berkeley. She said, ah. And then she said, another one of her favorite phrases, as I learned, on the contrary, it may even be better. Okay, so I became her teaching assistant.
And what did that sort of entail as the teaching assistant of Hannah Arendt?
On the ground, she had a large lecture, and then she did this regularly, a large lecture and then a small seminar. These were the selected people. These were lots of people. Lots of people came who weren't even students. Right. Largely because she was so controversial at that point. Nothing like now. Right. that's another story. People were busy telling me I shouldn't be associated with her at that point. On the contrary, now. But in any case, this would be full, and then there would be seminary. So I listened to all the lectures so that I knew what she was doing with them. I read their exams. Occasionally I met with some people that had questions. Didn't involve very much. The reading exams was most of it. Every once in a while we'd talk a little bit about what she was thinking about doing, which is to say she talked and I listened.
Right.
One learns to listen a lot when you have Hannah Arendt talking at you. And she also was very, abrupt. Not rude, not mean, just abrupt. So if you sort of said something and she was on a different thought track, which is on her thought track, she would just sort of say, and keep going. So I didn't have anything to say comparative anyhow. So I just listened to her. In some ways, much more what it meant, aside from being able to be in the seminar, was that she adopted me and took care of me and worried that my coat wasn't warm enough and worried that I was too skinny and took me out to dinner and talked to me about things like when she got back from Carl Jasper's funeral, she wore black for a year. And at one point I said, we were out to dinner, I said, are you going to wear black for a certain length of time? She said, for a year. And I said, may I ask why? I think it's a fine thing to do, but may I ask why? And she said, Americans like to pretend that death doesn't exist. This is a real thing in the present, and it needs to be recognized. Right. So she did. The other thing she did that had to do, I think, with being her teaching assistant and being in the relation that she thought that put me in, was that when the next paper needed to be done for her class, for the next class, she took me aside and she said, you don't have to do one. And I said, I don't. And she said, no, you do one if you want to, if there's something that's interesting to you, that you want to work through. And she said, I will, of course, read it. I'm glad to do that. And then she said, it's something that I've sort of passed on to my students through the years. I think it's a quite glorious thing that our system doesn't accept. She said, people can accidentally write a bad paper. They can't accidentally write a good paper. So she said, I know what you can do. So we don't have to worry about that anymore. We're free of that. Now make use of the paper, make use of that time for what's most interesting and useful to you. It's just so typical of her. She's going to interview the students. You don't have to do it if it doesn't make sense to do it, if something else makes more sense. Not at all like a progressive educator, just you don't put up with the nonsense part of it. Right. Or necessarily the ritual parts of it.
Right. Maybe now we can talk a little bit about, you've already mentioned the sort of controversy surrounding her at about this time. So this is a few years, I guess, after the New Yorker articles have come out on the Eichmann trial.
Right.
And so what was the reaction, I guess it's probably almost a decade after these things have come out, or maybe 5 years or so?
More like 5 years.
Yeah. Was it a reaction that had lasted a long time, or why was this controversy still present? And sort of, before we talk about how it was sort of formative for you, what was it like to be sort of living in that situation with her, I guess?
But your opening comment is interesting too. Why it was still going on? Yeah. Of course, it's a very interesting question, and one immediate thought I have is that even now it's still going on, in part. There are still people who talk about her as a self-hating Jew because of it, and disloyal to her people because she talked about the Jewish councils sometimes making the work easier. And, of course, the banality of evil, which seemed to trivialize that. That one has become a banality, so nobody's angry at that anymore. It's been destroyed in other ways as a very powerful and useful concept. I think it also went on irritating, initially infuriating and hurting, which is actually understandable. It was fresh, Right. And she had very few niceties. If what you find comforting in a deep sense, not just smoothing things over, if you feel safer and more comfortable with somebody who's just right there and thinking with you, as I do, I expect you may too, it didn't feel anything but wonderful. But if you're a survivor and you're trying to deal with the enormous complexity of that in your own ways, and somebody is simply is looking at some phenomena central to this experience and saying what she sees, and it doesn't fit into any of the categories that you've been working with as you tried to comprehend or to avoid or to get past or to forget, all those things we do. And she's simply looking at something straight on and then asking you to think in a way you have not thought before. It's like it blows fuses in even the best of people.
I guess, too, she's sort of reporting on something that is interesting from both aspects. So you're hearing Eichmann talk about what happened during the Holocaust, but also this is the first time we're actually hearing from the survivors at the same time, too. So I guess there's these two counter-narratives, and the sort of contrast between them, I guess, is pretty... It takes a long time to work through that. You know, the Jewish people had remained silent for a long time after the Holocaust, and during these trials is when we're really hearing about the details of what actually happened.
And that's one of the things that the people who put the trial on wanted from the trial, which she didn't approve of. The notion of a show trial, because she believed it. Justice, like moral responsibility, deals with the acts of the individual. Well, people didn't like that either. Here's the chance, finally, you know, to tell. Even like with the Me Too movement, now they do they do trials, and one of them they spent what, I don't know how many hours. Let's say 10, because so many people needed to talk. Well, of course, to be heard, but that's not what she thought a trial was for. So there are many counts, and of course there was also the Jewish establishment, which variously was felt. Obviously, not everybody in it. I don't want to depersonalize it. Felt attacked by extension. We could probably pursue that for a long time and uncover a lot. But here you have a figure being a kind of like a lightning rod. I'm sorry, that's a cliche, but drawing things toward her that were there and just vibrating in the air, and being this straight up and down woman who's going to say exactly what she thinks and ask you to think afresh, and being a woman. There was no question that was part of it. People said that to me.
So this all obviously had a large impact on you. So your latest book now, which I'm guessing is the culmination of many years of thinking about what Arendt says about evil. Could you tell us a little bit about these concepts of intensive versus extensive evil, and give us some examples of that in everyday life? So how are these two concepts different?
The intensive and extensive? Yeah. Can I do a little bridge into that?
Sure, you can.
Just so that
you can do whatever you like.
Really?
Yeah, well, yeah.
I went with her to these talks. At one point, this thought came to me. I found myself thinking, if she spoke about the evil of banality rather than the banality of evil, people might hear her better. I was struck by the fact that people couldn't hear what she was trying to say, and interested then, sort of what are the blocks and going. So I started thinking about banality. One can think about evil, and one can think about banality, and one can think about the startling juxtaposition. In this case, it's more than just a juxtaposition. It's evil of, or banality of evil. So it's it's a tight link. And it makes no sense to put those things together. One is over the top and one is deadened. Not even ordinary, deadened ordinary, and this is bad made over the top to evil. What are they doing together? So I started thinking more about banality and how that could possibly be associated with something monstrous. Because because it's there on the level of meaning to ask, and it's engaging, morally engaging. It's associated what seemed to me some of the most pressing moral issues we have. So I was hooked on this. And I quietly started reading examples of people who were thoughtless. Circling back, the banality of evil, when she's listening to Eichmann, this key point in that was that he was thoughtless, about which we could talk at length, but we won't. He wasn't thinking. And her question that is just crucial to keep in the context then is it possible that an inability to think and a radical failure of what we commonly call conscience coincide? Because that's what you saw in Eichmann. So what's going on there? And as I noted not very long ago, actually quite recently when I was rereading things, she took her question about thinking then, what is it about thinking that its failure could do this? Because the implication, of course, is that if we're doing it, conscience is less likely, at least, to have a radical failure. May not save us, but less likely to have a radical failure. So we need to understand thinking as well as evil, but she focused on thinking for obvious reasons. She went to the great philosophers to learn about thinking, to think about thinking with them. I was even particularly realizing it because of this interest in banality. What's the juxtaposition there? I went off and started reading about memoirs and testimonies and letters and interviews and sometimes novel because novelists often are better than anything else that you read in understanding something. The thoughtless people, which is to say the enablers, the perpetrators, the bystanders. In the course of reading all of these things, which I did for years, I was doing other things, but I couldn't stop doing this. Right. I needed to understand. So I read some pretty horrifying things, but also was fascinated because so often they sounded not like Eichmann. They were different, each one, but they were patterns. I wasn't reading hate-filled screeds against them. That isn't what I was finding. People on trial for their lives for having murdered hundreds, thousands of people, or worked slaves, or sold children into sex trade. There are interviews with all these people. It's interesting. And they don't talk that way. Convincingly don't talk that way. But they're doing these things. So I am hooked. Like, what's going on in your mind? How are you who are doing these things daily? How do you think about them? Not how do you feel about them. Because your mind is what's going to be shaping what you do and how you do it and making your choices. Maybe in concert with your feelings, maybe not. I needed to know how they made sense of that. So, at some point or other, sorry, it's a long lead-in, but otherwise it's kind of contextless. Yeah. You'll make a face at me if I'm going on in the wrong. Yes,
I can make a face if
Good.
you need me to. Yeah.
Okay. It struck me that the problem that people talk about with the banality of evil regularly, and has now become, problem's been turned into a banality, is, oh yes, ordinary people, petty little bureaucrats can do terrible things. And do. So that we had people after 9/11, remember Ward Churchill got in terrible trouble for saying they were working in the World Trade Center. They were all little Eichmanns. Well, that is a stupid thing to say, but that's the epitome of this notion of, we all have their little Eichmanns in the world, lots of, no, there aren't. This was extreme. The man was ludicrous. And what he did was horrifying. The juxtaposition was ludicrous and horrifying. Most people are not like that. And that's not what I'm finding. So, but it was the monstrousness of the deeds versus what they're saying, which is not monstrous. It's not like Mein Kampf. It's not like any of these things. And that's when, it's so funny, you sort of find yourself. She said she found herself with the concept of the banality of evil. There are moments when you've been immersed in something for a while, and it is literally like you find yourself with a concept. You think, That's what I found myself with, this concept of extensive versus intensive evil, and realized that a problem, and a big one, but a problem, in trying to understand how these apparently not very even interesting people were doing horrific things that, you know, the imagination just breaks in front of, was that we tend to think of evil as being monstrous acts done by monstrous people, because it makes sense. It helps to realize that there are, speaking very broadly, two kinds of evil. There are intensive evils, which are kind of the key cultural example of evils. Those are the ones where somebody goes berserk and kills people, goes on a rape spree, goes on a poisoning spree, something like that. Something that throws the whole culture around them off. And everybody says, this is insane. You know, it breaks all the rules. We don't even want to say, how did they make sense of it? They've gone nuts, is what we say, and that isn't even confusing to us. You know, we have legal categories for that. It's familiar enough. And that's the example that we have of evil. But then there are these evils that are in fact all around us, are historically more common, I would say, certainly in terms of the amount of harm done quantitatively. Instead of letting these intensive evils, short-term, over quickly, shocking, aberrant, precisely not normal, dominate our imagination, we need to in fact understand that there are extensive evils, which is, they extend, they take a long time. 3 months for the Rwanda genocide, for example, unto years. Slavery, still going on. Sexual abuse of children, still going on. Economic exploitation of children and the extremely vulnerable, still going on. So it can be, you know, the things that we know are going on. And then it can be genocide, which is, you know, the sort of key example of an extensive evil, and slavery. And the sexual abuse of the vulnerable and the less empowered culturally and so forth. Those take a lot of people to do and a lot of time. They say you can't commit genocide if you're just 10 madly hate-filled people. You might slaughter a lot of people, but A, you're not going to get everybody in a group. You can't possibly. And B, almost nobody can sustain that level of passion and that physical stuff day after day after day after day. So I found myself saying these extensive evils are the evils take a lot of people, are done over lengthy time and become normalized. So that people get up every day, go do their job, which may be killing, maybe overseeing labor and conditions no human being ought to be in, from slavery to child labor and so on. They go home, and they're perfectly respectable people and so forth. We're familiar with this as a notion now, but to actually take it in and say, no, this is different. It asks of us something different to comprehend it morally and therefore politically. We have to comprehend how the ordinary can turn, precisely the ordinary, not be perverted into now mass hatred. Not that there's a volcano always under all of us, you know, an id, a crazy person, unleash me and I'll murder anybody I hate, all of those explanations. Nor that I'm turned into an automaton, I will be obedient and do anything you tell me to. None of those things that sort of change us in some way, and are extreme in some way. It's actually the small things, the little vices and virtues of every day. Hard workers, reliable workers who are able to do it effectively and efficiently, as Eichmann could, but there were many, many others, for a very long time. People who are ambitious. You find that in every single one that I read. People, I ended up saying careerism is one of them, is the thing I found most often. That and a kind of low-level greed. I get a little bit more. I send gifts home from looting. I take the gold from the teeth. It's not even I'm in order to get $1 million. I'll do something terrible. I pick up a little here and there. I get a bigger apartment. I get an appointment to a higher position. I get to hang out with the bigwigs. People will become absorbed. Actually, there was a piece in the New York Times, I'm going to say like 5 months ago, about a woman in a town that had been occupied by ISIS, who, the day after they achieved final occupation, there were radio announcements and loudspeakers saying everybody is to go to work tomorrow. Somebody has recently said the scariest thing about ISIS is their ability to govern, not the intensive outburst. That's a show. It's real, it's horrifying.
Right.
But this is a different level. They did that. This woman, they offered jobs. They needed women for jobs to police other women, the modesty brigades or whatever they're called. They interview her in the Times, and she says, you know, oh good, I could have a job. That would give me some standing in my family and be interesting. I'd have a little status, a little money of my own. So she takes a job with ISIS. She reports other women daily. ISIS being smart, these things usually go in steps, not all of a sudden. If you do it all of a sudden, people say no.
Right.
You have to move them in. Step by step, they start beating the women, and it gets worse as they go. This woman's still doing it because she gets a little status in her family. She only stopped when one day she saw her best friend picked up and taken in and heard her being tortured. And then afterwards, she and her friend succeeded in escaping because the borders hadn't been closed tight yet. I mean, what are we going to do with that?
Right.
And that's what I found over and over again. So it's small, ordinary things, petty, functional. You want people who want jobs and who want status and have a little bit of ambition in most societies. So that's what extensive evil is. Obviously, I'm still thinking about it. I keep saying to people, daily, I can't stop taking the things out of newspapers and stuff. The stories like that, I keep thinking, oh my God, there it goes. Look, because it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe. We want it to be something worse than that.
So the planned question I had for you was about, maybe there's something troubling or problematic about always conflating evil actions with mental illness. But now I have something else I'd like to ask, so sorry for springing on you in the last minute.
That's fine.
You talk a little bit about the Milgram experiments, the quote-unquote Eichmann experiments, testing, obedience to perceived authority.
Right.
But a lot of things you're talking about now remind me of Milgram's teacher, Solomon Asch's experiments on social conformity. I don't know if you're familiar, there's a famous experiment he has with, he shows people a series of lines.
Oh, that's the
and
lines.
asks people which ones are longer.
Right.
And you're set with a bunch of actors.
Right.
And at a certain point, they all start giving the wrong answer. And 65% of people will conform to the answers of the people around them, even though it's not what they see. And a lot of people would actually report that they would question their own perceptual judgment. They thought, well, if everyone here is saying that they see line B as longer, but I don't, there must be something wrong with my perceptual apparatus, or I'm not judging correctly. And I wonder if that plays a role in these extensive evils too, and not just about perceptual judgments, but about judgments about value and about norms and things like that as well. Do you have any thoughts about that sort of idea?
Well, some.
No.
First I have to say something a little bit perhaps odd in response to the test, which is obviously a very interesting and telling one. It stays with us because it's so suggestive. One is, again, I think I want to say that doesn't startle me, which is to say, and this would be, I could get Arendt quotes on this too, and probably I got this from her at some point. I can't even tell. By now I've been thinking with her in my mind for so long. Not surprising. Even our perceptions are basically social, as is our language. And if I see something and nobody else sees it, I'm not sure it's real. I think that's a human phenomenon. I may then find, if I'm independent-minded, I'm stubborn, it's a particularly strong perceptual response. I mean, I myself would always have to check because I don't have good eyes.
Right.
But say I had superb eyes,
Right.
and I see something and nobody else is seeing it, I'm going to worry.
Right.
That's not odd to me at all. I might then do a variety of things, but I would certainly check with other people.
Right.
That this is one of the, this I know is Arendtian, and it's her doing something interesting with Heidegger, going from the clearing of being to the public space where we appear, that's one of the reasons we need a public life. Our sense of reality shakes if we aren't regularly, not all the time, we have to be alone. Some of us have to be alone a lot of the time. But we have to get out and check with other people. I once did a medical ethics project with other people statewide in North Carolina. And one of the things we kept finding, there were people doing medical ethics by way of teaching the principles of how you make decisions and consulting with people, you know, about, it's very large in medical ethics, as you know. We were asking people, how do you actually make your decisions and how has it been for you since you made your decision? Which is interesting to me because I don't want to be helping people to make decisions they can't live with. And most people are not Kantians born. So, and one of the things we found over and over again is that when people are trying to make that kind of an isolating, this is different from just seeing something, but I think there's a continuum. When people are trying to make an isolating decision, I mean, nobody's there with you quite. You may have one or two people who could be, if you're deciding to let your child die, for example. I mean, that's about as isolating as it gets. That people will then need to talk to people. Anybody, almost. Almost everybody I've talked to about this will say, oh, yes, I once, you know, was standing in the corner and the person next to me says, you know, I'm just coming from the hospital. And so I think this is the way we are. We're also perfectly capable of standing against everybody. I'm not saying that's the only or the definitive, but it's very, very strong for us. So I can't do much with that with regard to explaining this phenomenon. I'm sure it makes a difference. Of course, when the society around you turns, most of us will turn with it in terms of conforming. The startling thing is that people will conform to a changing order. As we said, it's very rare that it happens overnight. The people will do it before it's necessary, before it's normalized. It wouldn't get normalized if a lot of people didn't do it. So I'm not sure there are enough people, unless somebody who wanted to take over, pervert a regime, there are better phrases than that, I'm sure, but we'll take that for the moment, brought in a whole lot of people and had them wandering around talking the right language for it, then we might go very quickly. But otherwise, I don't think so. Something else is going on.
So now we'll return to the other question I was going to ask and just get your sort of thoughts about it. You know, I think it's pretty, and it brings it back to sort of contemporary issues, you know. In America right now, where you currently live, I'm sure you're well aware of the fact that every time there's some sort of horrific event portrayed in the media, it's become the go-to explanation is something to do with mental illness. And I don't want to say that mental illness doesn't exist or doesn't play a part many times in a lot of these actions. But do you see it as maybe problematic by always making the conversation about that evil things always have to do with people being insane versus talking about evils in some different sort of language? It doesn't seem like it's a requirement that you be insane to do evil things. And it doesn't seem like it's also necessarily an indicator that you are insane if you do something evil. So maybe something is getting lost there in this contemporary narrative about how evil and mental illness sort of hang together.
I think it's very dangerous indeed, actually. For one thing, it says we're losing a moral language, which worries me a great deal. We go to a sickness model instead of moral choice responsibility. And I think that's very dangerous. And it's a slur on people with mental illness, too, most of whom are less dangerous than you and I. Right. So it's not a good move. But I also think it's insofar as we have intensive evils, I myself am willing to consider that mental illness may be an aspect there. They're sometimes, not always, by any means, but there are occasionally, completely delusional people who can do something briefly in this great flurry of things. Yes, that could be mental illness, but that's intensive. I wouldn't want to downplay it. We're still doing terrible things. Right. And that's intensive. It's not extensive. If the people who do the work of extensive evils and some intensive evils were mentally disabled in some way or other, they couldn't do it. They have to be able to keep it up over time. Again, and other people around them have to be able to understand them and follow them enough to do that. If they're aberrant in some ways, we don't want to admit any kind of similarities to them. We may want to call them mentally ill. I think, again, that that's risky. And again, even if there were, and I think there may be, in some cases, people with some kind of mental issues, as there are in most groups, and these situations can be extreme enough that they may attract, but that's not most people. And again, they couldn't do it. It couldn't happen unless a whole lot of sensible, reliable people could do it. And then there are many other things to say, as you know. One of my regular ones is the psychiatrist who interviewed Eichmann. And when he came out, they said, well, is he normal? And he said, well, more normal than I am, having done so. Here he is talking to a man who says all the right things and has fine sentiments and sounds perfectly ordinary, a lot of familiar cliches about what it means to be good, and he says he's normal. Hannah Arendt's reaction to that story was, perhaps this tells us something about what we think is normal. And then I want to say, and that's dangerous. So, because the implication of the extensive evil, once you start looking at that, is insofar as we allow the notion of conventionality and cliche, sort of autopilot stuff, to play the role of morality, like pieties that people just utter and don't mean anything with at all, then everybody gets a nice buzz of feeling good. But that's no safer than being good because you're just following somebody else's orders. Both of those allow you to flip overnight if the system changes. I've been saying they don't flip overnight, but it allows you to go with the system when it flips. And that's in some ways one of our kind of definitions of sanity, you stay located with regard to other people. I mean, we know that extreme dictatorships tend to lock up people who are actually being sane. Joseph Heller, Hannah Arendt brought Joseph Heller himself to our class when we were doing the experience. She loved the idea of Catch-22, as you can imagine. You get one sane person saying, sensible person in the midst of a messed up, unsensible situation, and he's going to be the one who sounds like he's insane. Right. So, and with regard to the present situation in the United States, I think defining the people we're most worried about in terms of insanity is very liable to keep us from analyzing what we need to be analyzing, and putting far too much emphasis on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, whereas the people who are in charge isn't quite right, who hold the top governmental offices in the United States, similarly can't do a lot of harm if there aren't a whole lot of people who are supporting them, who are trying to get their own agenda served and putting up with it, not seeing the harm, gambling on that. People did that with Hitler too. We can manage him. He's a buffoon. And pursuing their careers and wanting to get reelected and liking it that their taxes have been cut. That's what I meant by careerism and greed and status seeking. These are ordinary things. But when they keep, not necessarily attractive, sometimes very bad if they're extreme, but they're familiar. They're not normally monstrous. When they kick in and keep people from seeing what's happening in different categories, people are still analyzing things in the categories they've got that protect their usual decision making and their life as it is. When you're doing that, it's not so hard to get you in service of some things that can be horrifically bad. And by the time people begin to realize that, the people who could actually, they're levels, they're like circles, right? By the time you get sort of out to, let's say, 3, 4 circles out, these people are in trouble too, and have often been gotten rid of. If you do such. I mean, I told you my first paper for Hannah Arendt was on the Great Purge Trials of '38 in Moscow. So they should know their history, these folks, which takes us back to this, the notion of thoughtlessness and banality, that if our minds aren't working, if we're keeping them busy with things we already know, or thinking about things we don't already know, but in terms that are already familiar to us, and that are approved by all the people around us, this is where the other studies, of course, play. Of course we have obedience to authority, and of course we adjust to people. That's ordinary. These things are all in play. You put them sort of all together in play, and people are going on about their lives using their minds, all of us, most of the time, using our minds, but not paying much attention. The test is whether we know when to pay attention. And once we've paid attention, then of course what we do, which is where Arendt then goes to issues of judgment. And I go to issues of organizing and political activism, which she would too, but the bridge between them is, of course, judgment. Then you have to decide what to do. Getting your mind working again, such that you actually can genuinely apprehend what it is that's happening, not fit it into categories like insane that you've already got, and break out of the categories we've already got, like evil is intensive, must be a monster, not a monster, I recognize this person. A lot of the supporters of our present regime in the United States recognize this and say, oh yeah, that's familiar, I know that. Because he's a walking cliche. I'm avoiding the name Donald Trump, but there it is. He's a walking cliche. He gives people the things that are familiar. So even if they don't like them, this is the circle out here, they're not the most dangerous ones, these are the dangerous ones. They recognize it and say, he's honest. When we start thinking honesty is a familiar use of convention, cliche, banalities, because it feels familiar. Must be being honest, I recognize that. We're not thinking.
Right.
So then we're vulnerable. But that's way out here. It's the people who make use, and that's true of sort of any of these regimes, and most regimes are always, one way or another, at risk of turning. Aristotle told us that. But we don't have to go through a cyclical theory. Of course they are. Why would they not be? If the seeds of this kind of ability to do anything, which is really what we're talking about here, we have the capacity to do anything if we're not thinking. Not all of us. I keep saying throughout my book, not all, not always. Insofar as we lead our lives pretty much on autopilot, which we also have to, because you can't stop and think all the time, or you'd be like Socrates, who used to stand in the marketplace and go stock still and so forth. And we all know that. become filled with thought and lose touch with where we are. I do that when I'm driving, you know, right? You say, I'm not paying attention. I was doing something else. That's what thinking does. So it's not like we can do it that kind of thinking all the time, but we can use our minds busily to such an extent with the terms that we've got that we don't pay attention. And insofar as we confuse that, which we do and can when things are basically decent enough, they're never going to be perfect, we can have a good life. A couple of senses of good, but it's always at risk. It's always at risk because the very virtues of daily life and of most people, that we do check our appearances with others. That matters. I mean, I remember doing a thing about ethics with some college students, and they were busy holding up as models of ethical people of intensive good, i.e. saints, and people who, as they said, don't care at all what other people think. You know, they go and they do it, and they fly in the face of everything, and they can do it on their own, and they can be martyrs. And I'm sitting there thinking, if that's what morality is, we're not ever going to get it. And I finally, he said to them, the fact that they kept saying that these were college students who were like 18, 19, and they kept saying, they don't care what they look like, they just do. And I finally said, if people care about other people and the world that they live in and how things are going, how other people feel, and what's important to other people, this is a good thing? And they said, yeah, that's a good thing. And I said, well, why is it a virtue, automatically a virtue, and to not care about that?
Right.
So we are like that, okay. But that's right there is this sort of, as I keep saying, it's a very small turn with huge consequences. It's difficult to wrap our minds around that. You have to learn to live in a different kind of at risk. I think people feel like we're living at risk, people who think about it. Maybe everybody, if you look at films and TV shows, we have scary things around us to externalize our monsters and so forth. Maybe we always live with this sense that something could, it's there. It could go very bad. It could be political. It could be aliens. But, things could go very bad and suddenly have things be a huge threat. But we turn them into external and very large things because it is a huge threat. To come back down and say, right here, in allowing ourselves to become banal, in not practicing episodically listening to the cliche to see if it's apt or not, little things. It's like we live with scar tissue. It's like we're not feeling the world anymore. That's what conventions and cliches and banalities and moralisms do. They keep us from being startled all the time and confused by things, and they heal over the hurts, and they make us a little less vulnerable. Okay? And, if there's a disease, I've forgotten its name. I've read it and tried to learn it, but I've forgotten it. Where your skin becomes impermeable, you die. That's what we can do with our minds if we're not thinking. So that takes me out the other side of this, the whole question of the banality of evil and the evil of banality. Evil is not banal. Evil is extreme. It's horrific. That's what we mean by evil. The banal can make it possible. And with the extensive ones, it is what makes it possible. I think that's what the relation is.
So I think that's a good place to end. I have many more questions about how ideology and dogmatism maybe make things banal.
Oh.
But I mean, that's the creation of the banal in a sense, but maybe we won't get into that.
That's up to you.
No, I think we probably run out of tape.
We didn't get to ideology. He says yes.